Hi, I'm Joe Navarro, and welcome back to People Watching. Today, I am with Jana Monroe, one of my best friends, a fellow FBI agent. She is responsible for getting me involved in the behavioral program, and she is the masterful author of this gem, Hearts of Darkness. If you want to really learn what it was like to be in the behavioral unit of the FBI, Jana is the person to both talk to and read from. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you, Joe. It's my honor.
I think it's important for the public to know, and she talks about it in this book, is the fact that the part of Clarice is really based on you being the first woman in that unit. And just so everybody is aware, you know, when I talk about the famous Clarice, we're talking about Silence of the Lambs.
You know, and actually, I think you almost don't even need to mention Silence of the Lambs. It's been amazing to me when you think of that film was made in 1991, and I'm honored to be able to do some public speaking events, and almost everybody in the room, regardless of their age, is familiar with Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly, you know, every time I hear that, hello, Clarice, it's, that's just spooky.
My name is Clarice Starling. May I speak with you?
May I see your credentials?
Certainly.
Closer, please. Closer.
You actually got to train
Jodie Foster for the role. Well, yeah, Thomas Harris was the author of the book, and he had quite a bit of access at the time. I thought maybe a little too much to Quantico, and excellent author in my opinion. But what he did was look at some of the cases, actual cases that we had, fictionalize them, and when you look back at the time that this was written in '89 and the movie was made in 1991, you didn't have female protagonists in law enforcement, specifically the FBI, and that's what he wanted. So when it came time to shoot the movie down there, I was the only female there, and so I got to work with Jodie Foster. I would say I was her advisor.
We go back many years. We won't tell the public.
Yeah, let's not. Yeah, don't tell how many.
How far back? In excess of 40 years, we've known each other. And we've been there at times when things were really bad after 9/11, and many criminal cases and espionage cases, because you helped.
Oh, absolutely.
With the counterintelligence program in the Phoenix division. Jana and I came into law enforcement approximately about the same time. You went to the police academy where?
That was in Southern California, and I did that to try to make myself more marketable to get into the FBI. That was the ultimate goal.
Yeah, and you know, when I think back of those days when we first came into the FBI and we were newbies, it was just a different time.
It was the dark ages, yes. It was a different time.
There were no computers.
No.
There were no cell phones.
There was no AI. There was none of the technology that we enjoy today.
There were none of that. What we did have was crime, and a lot of it. How did you get involved in the behavioral sciences at that time?
So the Behavioral Science Unit, which is at Quantico, Virginia, I got involved in that. I knew that was something I wanted to do, but there was a program in the field offices and in Tampa also called the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime Coordinator. Right. So I became one of those, which was I worked with the locals if they had a case appropriate to go to the Behavioral Science Unit, and that's how I got to know some of the agents in that unit.
Right. And so some of those agents who went on to write books was John Douglas.
John Douglas, yes, specifically. And John Douglas was the unit chief at the time that I was in the behavioral science unit. He was the first unit chief.
Yeah. You were the first woman in the what the public calls the profiling unit, but it was called.
Right. It was called the Behavioral Science Unit, which an interesting tidbit about that is later it became the Behavioral Analysis Unit. And the reason was one of my colleagues during voir dire, the judge took exception when he knew a little bit about what we were doing, the profiling. And he said, that's not a science, you're analysts. And we really weren't in a position to argue with the judge, and nor is that ever a good idea. Yeah. And so we changed the name to Analysis Unit. And yes, there were 11 men, and then when I joined, there were 12 of us.
You worked on some of the biggest cases that the country has ever looked at, especially with serial killers. Ted Bundy, you were involved with that. Which other cases were you involved with?
Well, Ted Bundy, who was one of the most prolific serial killers and a lot of name recognition, worked with him with my partner, Bill Hagmeyer, who actually, he was the one that elicited the confessions from Bundy. But Edmund Kemper, which there is a TV show out about that now I have not seen. Yeah. Dahmer and Jeffrey Dahmer, we were not obviously the arresting agency, but once he was arrested and the local law enforcement saw what they had from an evidentiary standpoint, with some of the posing of decomposing bodies, that sort of a thing, they elicited our help so that we could tell them what they were looking at and what kind of a person they should interview.
Right, and these are some of the ones that you get into in the book and many others. One of the cases that to this day still stands out, and most people aren't aware of it. There was a case in Tampa where a mother and two of her daughters. Well, tell us, what was that case about?
Okay, executive summary. It was Joan Rogers and her two daughters, Christy and Michelle. They were from Ohio, and one of the daughters was graduating from high school, and they'd never been out of the state of Ohio, so the high school graduation present was the three women were going to go to Orlando because they wanted to go to Disney World, and then to come to Tampa because they wanted to see the ocean. They wanted to see the bay. Yeah. Their father, they lived on a farm, and he couldn't come with them because he needed to, work on the farm. So they went to Orlando, came to Tampa, and this is where it really, the evil set in. They went out with a man they didn't know, but they had met. We are assuming had met at their hotel. Mm-hmm. They went out with him in his boat, and then unfortunately they were killed, and found a few days later where they had been thrown into the bay. Their hands had been tied. They had 55-pound cinder blocks tied to them to weight them down. What the killer did not recognize was the buoyancy of gases and what happened. Right. So they came floating to the top. Yeah. Brutally murdered. Brutally
murdered. And I remember arriving in the Tampa division at the time. I had just been transferred in from Puerto Rico, and people were still talking about this case. What's interesting about the case, obviously, one of the first things you mention is the victims, and you always remember them. You remember their names, and of course, you got to see the photographs and so forth, and those stay in your mind.
They're etched in your mind, yes.
Forever. What stood out for me when I got to Tampa was, you don't think about this as being a town where somebody's going to be killed like this. You've got Disney Worlds, you got Busch Gardens, you got the beaches. When I got to Tampa, as you did, it was a town where people said good morning to you as you walked around. And then to have this, and for me it was a reminder that there are no safe places as long as there are predators around.
That's correct, and unfortunately there are always going to be predators around. So, and I think when you look how horrific this case was, you described Tampa perfectly, and Florida overall is very a tourist area, right? So that's a lot of the economy. And this case specifically decreased tourism because it got negative publicity and people were afraid. And to your point, they figured, God, this isn't a safe place to go on vacation. We'll go somewhere else. So it really did impact the Tampa area.
You talk about this case in the book.
Yes. Yeah.
And one of the things that, I'm often asked, well, do agents ever disagree on things? And but
We have to chuckle at that one.
we have to chuckle.
That would be a yes.
Because
Yeah.
we disagree on things. But, you know, let's be clear on something. This investigation had been going on. There were very few leads. There was one piece of evidence that was left, I believe, that was found that had the writing. Tell us about that.
Well, and St. Petersburg Police Department has the jurisdiction on this, and they did an excellent job. So this is certainly nothing against them at all. But what happened was they had exhausted all of their leads, and they were very driven to have this come to a conclusion. So they came. So I went from being in the Tampa office to being transferred to the behavioral science unit. So now I got the case again because this was my area. Right. So some of the officers came to Quantico, and we started I wouldn't really have called it a cold case, but they had really kind of they didn't know where to go from this. So we took out all of the evidence, looked at it again like it was a fresh new case. And there was a little piece of paper with handwriting on it, and it was from directions from the hotel where the Rogers had been staying to the dock where the boat was, and then ultimately where the bodies were found floating. So I asked, whose handwriting is that? Yeah. And they said, Joan Rogers, the mother. And I said, well, how do you know that? Silence. So what happened was two of the officers went to Ohio, where they were from, and spoke to the husband, the father, and he said, that's not my wife nor my daughter's handwriting. So what we ended up with was unknown handwriting.
And where was the piece of paper found specifically? Was it on the victims?
No, the piece of paper was found in their rental car.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, right in the console.
So right in the console.
Yes.
So so you point out, well, okay, so here's a piece of paper. What's the origin of it? Turns out, checking, it's not the wife's handwriting.
Assumptions were made.
Assumptions were made. Okay. So now we get to something where, you know, years later, and I've thought about this, and you came up with the idea, and it's you have to think about this as being singularly genius. Because nobody else, and I mean nobody else, was going along with it. What was that?
Well, before the internet, so my thought was Dale Mabry is a large business-oriented street, large street.
It's a 6-lane highway.
Yes, in Tampa.
In Tampa.
And there were many billboards.
Right.
So we went to the community, because again, it costs money to put things up on billboards, and everybody volunteered. We'll pay for it. What we did was we blew the handwriting up to billboard size and put it on the billboards in Dale Mabry, thinking of all the literal traffic that we would get. And to a pleasant surprise, within 48 hours, we had quite a few responses, but 3 of them all gave the same name.
Now, here's what's interesting. Statistically, you know, if you had come to me, if I had been your supervisor, I probably would have said, Jana, this isn't going to work. Well, first of all, what are the chances that these people are from somewhere else? What are the chances that somebody is going to recognize the handwriting, number one, and number two, that person is going to be on Dale Mabry
driving by
and sees this writing, and I've been wrong many times, but I think this is one where if I had been in the unit, I would have said the statistical probability of somebody recognizing this is insignificant. And yet, within how many hours?
48.
You had 3 people.
Yep.
That is, to me, that is just incredible.
Let me give a little of the backstory as to why, because again, when you're looking at the technology available today, this would not be the tool that you used. But the offender in this, if you will, was in his own business putting up aluminum siding and the little patios with the screened in so you don't get eaten alive by bugs.
Right.
Apparently, he did not do very good work and he wasn't competent. But to add insult to injury, he was in small claims court. So some of the customers that he had that he'd done really bad work, They had taken him to small claims court. Well, he was a prolific writer, and we're talking with cursive, we're talking handwriting. So he would refute what they said, and he'd be nasty in the letters they was sending back to these people. So they were angry. So they also, here they are suing him, and now they're angry, and so they recognized his handwriting.
That handwriting.
Yeah.
And of course, we're talking about the suspect in the case. They
Yes.
recognized his handwriting. I think today it would have, because we do things by text, we email or we text, there would have been no record of handwriting.
No, and of course, text, you don't look at the actual texting part of it. It would be more the content and the manner in which, or words that somebody used.
Word choices.
Yeah, but you wouldn't put that up on a billboard, so.
Yeah. No, so when I get the question all the time is, well, because I was in a different unit. I ended up in the behavioral analysis program, which is on the national security side of the house. Jana was on the criminal side of the house, basically, which was in the behavioral sciences unit. But when I'm asked, did you guys always agree? Maybe they could appreciate how tense and vocal and sometimes aggressive some of those meetings.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and I think that's part of the healthy dialogue is good. This went a little over the top sometimes, but everybody has an ego, right? But you had some big egos in the unit, but you also had some people with great experience. But and you get this way sometimes when you think that you are right and you're basing it on something. You would definitely argue with others. But I think the good part about that is we all came from a little bit different experience, so we could articulate our part. The bad part was the manner, like you said, the arguing in which it was done, because I think that made, pugilistic stance sometimes a little more combative than necessary, but you wanted to be heard.
Yeah, well, and especially in that unit, you're the only female there, and really at the women started only coming into the FBI in the very late 70s, I believe, or early 80s?
Late 70s, and it was after J. Edgar Hoover passed away.
Finally.
Well, that's why they put the term limit in. He was the director of the FBI for almost, I think it was 49 years and 9 months, something like that. But he did not allow women to be agents in the FBI, so it was a class action suit after he died. I was not a part of that, but it was the suit that was won because the other federal agencies were already allowing women in. The FBI was the last.
Yeah. And I can just imagine you sitting in that unit saying, "No, I think we ought to put up a billboard." And I remember some of those personalities. I mean, I remember, like John Douglas, who when I went back for training, John Douglas was one of the guys that taught one of my classes. So I can see people rolling their eyes, pounding the desk, and being in disagreement. But how do you think what was it that made you prevail on that case? Because I know that a lot of people were not in agreement with that, and yet that solved the case.
Well, I think I worked seamlessly with the locals, so the ones that had the jurisdiction, so we were in agreement on that. And once the handwriting was identified not to be that of the victims, it was like, oh, okay, then we do have a gap, we do have a missing piece. And I think I would say all of us that were working on that were extremely dogmatic, and I was always very resilient. You had to learn to tune out insults, eye rolling, inappropriate comments. It's just, I felt, and I'm going to use the word felt instead of thought, that we were definitely on the right track. And what do we have to lose for something like that?
Yeah.
So I was extremely perseverant on that. And John Douglas he listened.
Yeah.
And some of the other guys didn't, but he was the boss. So I figured I just had to appeal to him.
So you just had to appeal to him.
Yes.
And what people forget too is a lot of the recommendations, sometimes there was budgetary problems because it's not like we had infinite. I remember in Tampa we had a case where we thought a child had been abducted and then maybe had been disposed of in a lake. And I remember calling back to the unit. By then you had left. And I called back. I think you were in the Los Angeles division at the time. And the unit said, well, just drain the lake and and find the body. So we called some local companies that had these
lake drainers,
these massive pumps, and the amount of money
yes.
that it would cost. And then there was the little question: what are we going to do with 40 billion gallons
of water? Yes, yeah.
And it's not like you can do anything and everything.
Well, and that's, I think, the negative piece, because it's entertainment. But when you look at all the movies and the TV shows, how they're flying around, and they never even talk about budgetary constraints. And that's one of the things. In going back to Silence of the Lambs, they showed they showed Clarice, which she was a trainee, so that wouldn't have happened anyway.
Right.
But flying around on the private FBI jet, I never saw that. I would have loved that. But,
me neither.
Yeah.
And like your husband, I was a bureau pilot, and I never saw that.
You never saw it either.
I never saw that magic.
Right.
Yeah. And, people, you'll find this funny, but, is how many times we had to sometimes double up and triple up in a room because the bureau just didn't have money to pay for a hotel room.
You mean at the Motel 6?
Yeah, if you could, find
yeah.
it. I remember in Phoenix, Arizona, the total budget you would get for a day to stay in a hotel was $19.
Yeah, and even then, $19 was like nothing. Yeah.
No, and most hotels at that time, they wanted $35, $40, and and I was working by myself, so it's not like I could ask somebody to double up with. But have agents had to double up and triple up?
Well, I even slept in my car once when I was doing some work in Gallup, New Mexico, and didn't even have enough for one of the rooms. I chose not to stay in one of the rooms, so I thought locking the doors in the car, having my gun available, I'll just sleep in my car. But
the fun sacrifices we make. One of the things I find interesting, and I know you do too, and we were talking about this yesterday at dinner, is that usually the public focuses on the bad guys. Whether it was the bank robbers of old, the gangsters, and even with serial killers, there's a weird, morbid fascination with them. But your perspective and mine was always with the victims.
The victims, Joe, and you're so correct. I mean, the subject matter itself is compelling and repulsive, and I think that's what draws people to it. On your, spectrum of normal, right? It's very hard for people to understand what motivates someone to do that. And that's a good thing, that they can't put themselves in that position. But that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because to me, I got very frustrated with the fact that there's this name recognition for all the bad guys, so to speak, the serial killers. And although you can't realistically have name recognition with the numerous victims.
Right.
But it's not only the victims themselves, it's their parents, the family, the friends, that ripple effect of people who cared about their loved ones. And I dedicated my book to those victims.
To the victims.
Right.
It's certainly a perspective that I've always taken, and in essence, you began to teach me back in the late 80s about, these are people who have been victimized in many ways, usually physically, mentally, in all these ways. But nobody ever talks about it. But, for me, and I know it is for you, the first thing that we think about is the victim, because we're the ones that respond to crimes, whether it's a bank robbery or a kidnapping, and we have to deal with that child that has been abducted and the trauma that they have to go through. But then we have to deal with the parents and everybody else. And while, I always say it's interesting to look into the abyss, as Nietzsche said, the abyss is always looking back at you. And I think, tell me this, because you begin to address it a little bit in the book, about the effect of working with victims over time.
Right. There is an effect and an impact, and that's one of the things that's good about being human, right? Because if it didn't, then I think you're sociopathic. So even though you try to be stoic and you have to be professional and you detach, because that's the only way you can, with a clinical detachment, I think it's like a doctor or something, you can't get emotionally involved, but subliminally and subconsciously, I was involved. And it was one of those things I had to, my husband pointed out when I started doing some odd things that, maybe this is kind of getting to you a little bit more than you thought, because when you do feel, and I did feel for the victims and their parents and everybody that's involved in that, and it's hard not to, but you've got to maintain that equilibrium between doing your job and having that compassion.
Yeah. Oh no, I remember it clearly. One thing is I remember in the Phoenix division, which was my first office, and you ended up being a special agent in charge there.
Yeah, that was my last office.
Your last office. She was she was the boss lady. And we, had a case there where a child was victimized, and you're dealing with the child, you're dealing with that trauma, you're dealing with the horrifics of it and the parents, and then let's not forget, 6-7 months later, you get a call from the United States Attorney's Office that says, "Oh yeah, this is a crime on a government reservation, and we're going to prosecute." And now you have to contact the victims, and that whole trauma and convincing them that this is the best thing to do, to testify in court, and maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and when you do that, I feel the compassion for that, because then what you're requiring them to do is to relive this matter. And not only reliving it in the context in which they did, emotionally, psychologically, but also for a court hearing, which is different because there's different aspects and ways that you're going to testify in court to that. And to me, that was always the negative part, and yet you had to make it a positive to them, right? Because this is what we need to do so that you can find some closure and, as we call it, some justice.
Yeah, and one of the things the whole process, a lot of times the crime goes down, a bank robbery can go down in about 3 to 4 minutes, but getting ready for court, where there are depositions and there are pre-court get-togethers to figure out what evidence is going to be presented and so forth. These things take weeks and months. And so for the victims, it was bad enough to have this 4-minute experience where a gun was in their faces, but now to be deposed and, defense is going to, what kind of weapon was it? And they're going to attack the testimony. And it's not just reliving it, sometimes it really compounds the effect.
Good word. That's exactly what it is. It compounds it, and usually it's protracted. So you're talking about how long it takes for some of the evidence, but then they have continuations, and somebody's on vacation, and somebody asks, it could even be like a change of venue depending on what's going on with it. So it's a much longer, I think, emotional journey than what they had originally.
Yeah. It can be traumatizing over and over again. And you're right. The question is, are we achieving justice? And my take has always been, well, this is as close to justice as we're going to get. But what is your take on it?
Well, yeah, and I think, justice throughout my career and my journey has changed the connotation. Just by having experience and seeing so many things. And I completely understand why some people don't want to reopen that wound and do that. I mean, justice has a different meaning for different people. And so justice, is it vengeance? Is it revenge? You can never bring back a loved one. I'm not talking about bank robberies on here, but you can't bring back a loved one. But fortunately, I think, I'm a little biased, but our system in the United States that we have, and the legal system, is probably, although it has many flaws, as good as you're going to get with trying to reach justice.
Justice, yeah. And I think, if you look at social media now and the effect that has, where, in small town USA, you might have 23 people show up to a trial to watch. The newspaper would report on it. And now it's not unusual to have tens of thousands of people on the internet following it, and then they go into different camps. she's lying, he's lying,
Right.
and that whole thing. And have you seen a change in how victims are dealing with this? Because a lot of, I've seen some people who have said, I don't want to go through that, and I don't want to go through the social media gauntlet.
Oh, absolutely. A good way to put it. It is a gauntlet, and it's like the court of public opinion. And to your point, previously there'd be a few, and now because of technology, there's all kinds of people weighing in on opinion. And I think the real danger of that is you've got people, again, that have little tiny bits of information, and they're expressing an opinion based on that. They don't know the entire thing. But yet as a victim, you're listening to this, and if it's things that are negative and they're, things that are even more emotionally harming, that's going to also make you not want to get out there in that public eye.
Yeah, I'm thinking of some recent trials, like the one of Johnny Depp. There was a trial, and people were, hard on one side or hard on the other, and so forth. And what was interesting is not many of it listened to the actual testimony.
That's right.
But they'd come home from work and they'd get on the internet and, well, I support him, or I support her. And I think, as a victim, and I mean, as you know, I was a victim of a crime. I was, I think, 17 years old, and
Just a few years ago.
Yeah, just the other day, and I was stabbed in Hialeah, Florida, and I remember the trauma of that, and I just can't imagine then having to deal with what kids now have to deal with the internet, having to justify or explain why didn't you do something different? Like, why did you get in the way of the guy
of the knife?
Of the knife.
Well, and that's when you look at cyberbullying, and that whole thing, and how young the people are. So not only do you have that from an emotional standpoint, and so many, but let's face it, when you're 8, 9, 10, 11, you don't have the emotional maturity and experience to know how to deal with that. To me, that's the part that's very frightening. You see suicides, you see people don't have the tools to know how to handle this at that young age.
Yeah, I remember when, I forget what year it was, but it was the first time I had heard, and it happened in Lakeland, Florida, where a young girl, I think she was in middle school. That was the first time that I had heard of somebody committing suicide because of
tragic.
Not the bullying in the classroom, but the actual bullying online. And of course now you read about these all the time, and so it's almost as if the bad guys have found yet one more vector.
That's right.
To victimize.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you look at it, there are tools to help with that, but right now I think we're kind of in the stage of it's going to be a phased approach, and there are organizations out there, but it's still the thing that the kids or the younger people need to either reach out for that or tell someone, and there's a big reluctance a lot of times to go to their parents because their parents really aren't aware of what's been going on, and they feel that they wouldn't understand, and so it's something they feel they've got the weight of the world on their shoulders.
That's a good point, is where do the parents fit in all of this? But there's so many ways to now reach children, whether it's through legitimate channels like a phone that they may need for access to the internet, or with their friends they may have older friends that then have access to other things. You mentioned something earlier, the cyberbullying, because in one of the highest positions that you had in the FBI was you were the head of the cyber program.
Yes, I'm laughing, I'm chuckling, because you have to go back to 9/11, go back to that time frame. And although the FBI had cyber entities in the field offices, it didn't have a cyber program.
Correct.
And right after 9/11, that was changed. And so then FBI Director Robert Mueller asked me to come back and be the assistant director of the cyber division. I jokingly told him, well, sir, I don't know if cyber is spelled with an S or a C. I then learned he didn't have a big sense of humor. And I also said, I'm sure you can find someone else for this position.
Yeah.
And his comment was, you don't seem to understand. I am not asking you, I'm telling you. I'm like, oh, okay.
It's take a typical bureau, they volunteer you.
I was voluntold. But I think what he said to me, and then I got it, was that a lot of my work was testifying on the Hill between Senate and congressional subcommittees to define the prowess and jurisdictional prowess between Secret Service, the FBI, and oh, by the way, in the middle of that, they stood up the Department of Homeland Security. So who was doing what, and what kind of a budget, and then what was the capacity and capability of cyber.
Right.
So,
which at the time, unfortunately, the bureau just people don't understand the budgeting process, and I know the viewers may not be interested, but I think it's important that the budgeting process takes so long that by the time you get a budget, the events sometimes have moved forward, and I'll never forget, and you'll remember this. If in 1980s we were fighting the war on drugs, and then all of a sudden we were fighting the war on
terrorism, yes.
But to get the budget, to get even translators who spoke Farsi or Arabic,
absolutely.
It takes years to get that on board, and I famously or infamously, either way, I tell people that I retired from the FBI in 2003, and in our office we were still using Windows 95. And that was
you had a computer. I mean, come on. Index cards.
Well, we call that a computer. I think it had like 250K the processing speed, but it's not like in the movies where the blue screens and all these.
And they get information like that. I love that. I want to work for that organization.
I want to where all the equipment works. But it was very difficult to do our job in that time period because, and I can see why the director brought you back for your leadership skills, because technology, if you remember, was advancing so quickly. I mean, I remember the first time I'd heard that they were going to put cameras in phones, and I was like, what? How is that going to work?
Well, I had to get ready. When I first heard that they were going to look at you, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to take so much longer getting on a phone call. I've got to do my hair. I've got to do all these kinds of things. Where before, you just picked it up and said hello. Now there was a lot of pre-work.
But the other story I tell is the people that clean the streets in downtown Tampa had cell phones 2.5 years before the bureau agents had cell phone, and that it goes again to the budgeting process where Congress doesn't want to vote on a budget, and shockingly these things happen.
That was probably the rudest awakening of my experience was testifying before Congress. I'm not being negative about Congress, but it was a totally different experience. And if you've heard the term of grandstanding, I would be invited on behalf of the FBI to talk about cyber, just what I'd said. It's like, what does your budget look like? What are you doing with it? I'd have to explain all of that. And as it was my turn to speak, some of the Congress people would get up and walk around, and so it was annoying because I didn't get the impression that they were listening to me, and so I said, "Are you people listening to me?" And they shut my mic off, and the agent that was with me, they called the backbenching, the real cyber expert, in case they asked a technical question, he had to come up and whisper in my ear. He goes, "I think we've been dismissed." So I had to learn how to maneuver that.
To deal with. Well, I'm glad I didn't have to deal with any of that. You retired what year?
I retired in 2006.
So, and I was pushing you.
Yes, you were.
to write this book ever since then, but I'm often asked especially by a lot of agents as they're approaching retirement, and they said, "Well, what's the outside look like?" And I said, "Listen, if you're successful in the bureau, you're going to be successful on the outside, and you have had nothing but success." Can you name some of the organizations you worked for.
Well, yeah, I worked for three after retiring, KPMG. I then worked for Southern California Edison, which is an electric utility, including a nuclear plant, which was a whole different type of security.
That was practically all security work. I mean,
Yes.
management. So you were the head of that.
Right. I was what they called, on the outside of the bureau, the chief security officer. So I was the vice president of security. And what that actually encompassed was, well, it was investigations, it was compliance, especially when you're looking at an electric utility with a nuclear plant. Very heavily regulatory driven.
Yeah.
So a lot of regulatory things. I had the cyber piece of it in addition to all of the security for the buildings and the plants.
Right, because there's banks are easy to secure. Places that have nuclear, or at least even fissile material, is always a potential threat.
Well, and you look at this particular plant, so it's in the Los Angeles area and had approximately 15 million customers. And there was just a lot of communication things that you had to get to, the rates, reading the meters, different things like that. Even when they went digital, where there would be a lot of complaints and a lot of issues, and to me that there should have been a complaint department, but that was what they looked at security for,
wow.
right? And then I ended my career with, which I thought was a great opportunity, to go to Herbalife Nutrition. And why that was a good opportunity for me is they had no security. They were in 96 countries, some of them hostile. And they had over 8,000 employees and many distributors. It was a multi-level marketing business model, so they had distributors, not employees, selling their products. Well, they had been attacked by a venture capitalist to try to take the stock to zero, and they found listening devices in the boardroom, the CEO's office, and the CEO's home office.
Wow.
They had an assessment done, and the assessment said, you need a security department. So I got to build it from the ground up.
So it's what we used to call industrial espionage.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Which is illegal.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
No, I mean, I remember when a lot of states didn't have statutes to
No,
deal
you're right.
with putting a microphone in somebody's office and so forth, and why a lot of companies now do a technical sweep.
Yes, we did a lot of tech sweeps for that. And I think for me, when you mentioned that, I was in a law enforcement cocoon for 30 years. Yeah. And then to go out into the private sector, it was I make it analogous to landing on the moon, which I've never been there. And I paid a lot of attention, made sure that I kind of knew what I was talking about before I started offering my comments and my observations. But what I learned that was exceedingly helpful was everything that I had learned in law enforcement, although the cultures were quite different, I could apply those same tools, if you will, to the private sector. And it worked. And it made, once that light bulb went off, it made it a lot easier.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's the concepts are all the same. You know, we talk about in the private sector, people talk all the time about negotiations, and in the FBI, try to negotiate with a bad guy to get them to confess.
Right.
That is negotiation.
Absolutely.
At its absolute cleanest form, because everything is working against them, and you're trying to convince them that they should act against their own best interests, and it is a mind game, and it is negotiations at its purest form.
Yeah, and I think for me, I'll go back to the behavioral science unit, and it sounds odd, but what I learned from serial killers, I could apply to CEOs. I say that jesting, but when you looked at the work that we were doing at the time I was in the unit, which was trying to learn, the question that I still don't think is answered is, why do serial killers or prolific killers do what they do? Yeah. What's the motivation? What sets them apart from the normal people? And we had nothing to offer them. We couldn't have a stay of execution. We couldn't get them to a different prison cell. We couldn't get them better food. So why should they talk to us? What we did was appeal to their ego, and two separate ways. One was like, you were so successful, you're so accomplished at this. We don't know how you did that. Could you educate us?
Yeah.
that usually worked. The other, and I do believe that they were not genuine with this, but those that said they don't want others to follow in their footsteps. So we would say and approach it like, okay, you don't want other people, young people, to do what you were doing. You don't want what you have done to be glamorized. Help us by saying, why did you do it, and what is it we can do to teach people to not take the path that you did?
One of the things that I've always wanted to ask you is, what was the biggest surprise for you? Because you were in the Bureau far longer than I was. What was the biggest surprise when you got out and you started working in the private sector?
Oh, number one, it was like landing on the moon. Okay, so a very, very different climate and culture.
Yeah.
But the biggest surprise, I would say, is when it resonated with me that the tools and the things that I had learned, the experience that I had garnered in law enforcement, in the FBI specifically, was the same that I could adapt and approach my corporate experience. So it was like some of the things, and this sounds odd, that I learned from serial killers, and when I say learned from, was how to elicit information from them, how to read them, nonverbal communications, of which you're an expert. Those same things applied when I got to corporate. So it made maneuvering that environment much easier.
Yeah, because when you're talking to the bad guys, or in the corporate world, you're dealing with egos, you're dealing with personalities, you're dealing with flawed characters, you're dealing with people that can be cranky, cantankerous, everything else.
Cranky pants, that's one of my favorite technical terms. But no, you're so correct when you are able to read the room and look at, like, okay, somebody has a totally different agenda. The agenda is me, myself, and I, right? When you can read that into someone, it's like, okay, you're going to approach them very differently than someone else. And when I first started in corporate, I asked if I could be a part of the C-suite, the executives, although my role was not. And the CEO, I remember, asked, well, what are you going to get from that? And I said, oh, a lot. And what I got from that was reading the room. So you would see the person somebody would have a great idea, and the person next to him would give the same thing and just change 2 words. And it's like, okay, don't talk to him. It would be like, who is the person that's actually, regardless of their title, that holds the clout and the weight, and who should I get to know to help me?
Yeah, it was no different. For me, it was number one, realizing that the private sector, I just assumed they knew everything we knew about personalities and body language and stuff. And I get out and it's like, what do you mean you don't look at body language when you walk into a room? You don't test the temperature of the room. You don't see who the alpha males are, and
all of those things. I also took that for granted. And when you're talking about negotiation, the art of negotiation, even though you're negotiating something entirely different, the toolkit's basically the same, and it was very, very foreign to most of them.
Yeah, the big thing I found was the language, where in the private sector you say, well, we're going to do some due diligence, and for us it was, so is he lying?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I had to change my vernacular, and that was one of the things I paid the most attention to, because as you know, if you're speaking a different language, it's not going to resonate. So I would literally write down, it's like, okay, I use this word, they use that word, don't use this anymore, so that I could mentally, have it be muscle memory.
Yeah, exactly. We in the private sector, you never say, well, sometimes you just got to get in their face.
No,
in the private sector,
yeah.
you would say, well, we're going to have a difficult conversation. And
well, and the thing that I learned right away too, which I thought tempered it a little mild, I'm going to push back. So that was, when you would talk about in some of our FBI colleagues, where we'd get into healthy but some vigorous arguments back. Oh, you don't do that. That was not acceptable. It's like, okay, I'm going to push back a little, and which means I have a different idea than you do.
Yeah, because in the bureau we just said, well, you're full of.
Yes, yeah, we would say that.
we were so direct, and one thing I always found interesting, and I know you've been working with Hollywood on some things. I've worked with Hollywood over the years on some things. and they always get this wrong on in the movies and on TV shows, is agents don't talk to each other like you see in the movies.
No.
Agents actually talk in a very clipped, very direct,
Yes.
very stark language because we don't have all day.
Yeah, it's like, get with it. What do you want? Yes, no. Well, see, that was the other thing. And well, this is just kind of how my mind works. When I ask somebody a question, I don't want to hear blah, 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 because then I'm looking for the answer somewhere. But I think if you say yes or no, and then give me the reason, and I think that was a lot of my law enforcement colleagues spoke the same way. And you didn't find that in corporate.
No, you don't.
Too direct.
And there's too direct. And I think there's an efficacy to being stark and being direct because you get an immediate answer. It's yes or no. It's not gonna happen.
Yeah.
And that directness, our colleagues were the same way. You instantly knew. You didn't have to hear all the flowery stuff behind it. It's in one of my books, which and you know her in the 3 Minutes to Doomsday. I talk a lot about Terry Moody.
Moody.
She's a good friend of both of ours.
A great agent.
Fantastic agent.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget talking about direct. She comes down the stairs and says directly, in a very loud voice, to my supervisor, and this is as direct as you can be. There's no way I'm working with Navarro.
There's nothing to equivocate there, right? I mean,
it was a complete sentence. And then she turned around and went back upstairs.
I mean, yeah, and then when you talk about Hollywood and the entertainment thing, the thing that always gets, and I love entertainment. So, but when you have a bad guy or a bad woman, right, and they've got a gun, they've got somebody down, and then they start telling, "Mom always liked you, but they came to kill them." She'd be like, hire kill somebody, just kill them. And it's like you don't have. That's not the opportunity to have this conversation where all these emotional things that you should be telling a therapist.
Yeah, it's like that famous Clint Eastwood movie where somebody comes in to kill him and begins to talk, and I think it was Clint Eastwood says, "If you're gonna kill."
Yeah.
just shut up. But the other thing I wanted to ask you, because you saw directly the effect of this, is especially starting in the late 80s, early 90s, is the effect, what we came to call the CSI effect, where the public was so fascinated with the forensics of cases, and how then they would, juries began to ask the judge, well, why didn't they lift fingerprints instead of that? But maybe you can clarify for the public is how unusual it is to find a fingerprint at the scene.
Well, again, there we get for entertainment. And of course, you can't blame people. So some days when you type at your desk all day long, so they don't have a day in a life, that would be extremely boring. So you've got to compound things like that. But yeah, some of the things that they would do, they'd find a fingerprint, or even more unusual, the DNA, and they'd have it back in 2 hours or 2 days. I mean, there is such a prioritization that goes along with that, and there's only so many labs that conduct that work.
Yeah.
So the frustration would be, is my case more important than the 2,000 others that are ahead of me? Yeah. But in entertainment, they get all of this evidence back right away. So I think the armchair CSI folks that were juries, they came to expect this. It's like, well, I watch CSI, or I watch Forensic Files, and so the expectation is that in real life you can get all of these things done, you can find it, and you can get it processed within hours.
Within hours.
Yeah.
As you know, when I was in Arizona, I worked primarily crime on government reservations, and a lot of the Indian reservations. And so by the time I got to my next office in New York, I had already been to 24 homicides. And I never found a complete fingerprint. You'd
just
find,
laying there.
Yeah, you'd find smears, you'd find partials, stuff, but nothing that you could use in court because you have to have a certain amount. Did we find hairs? Yeah, but in many places, like in hotel rooms, you might have upwards of 200 different hairs.
And then when you look at it too, of course, DNA and things have improved, but if you don't have the hair root, the hair follicle, it's basically useless.
Yeah, and this concept of the DNA back in 2 hours. I think the most important case I ever worked on, and it was actually a national security case, and we were tracking some bad guys that had come in from the Middle East. The earliest we could get DNA done, I think, was in about 3 weeks, and this was a priority case.
That's about accurate. 3 weeks is really good
because you forget that it has to be processed in a very specific way.
Yes.
The DNA has to be broken away from the actual roots.
I think the other thing too, so that we're talking about prioritizing cases, the number of cases, well, there's only so many people in a lab that can do that work too, and they're human beings, so some of them might take a vacation, some of them might be sick or doing something else. So all of those human things factor into it, which entertainment doesn't account for.
It doesn't account for. So I want to thank Jana Monroe for taking the time to spend a few days here with us. Hearts of Darkness, thank you for your service to your nation and for being such a great friend. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, and back at you. Thank you for your service and for your friendship, Joe.
Thank you.